The bride arrived in the small town in the late afternoon. The sun was low, casting a warm glow over the dusty streets and wooden buildings. She looked out of the window of the old carriage and tried to keep her thoughts steady. Everything felt strange and heavy. She had imagined this day for months, maybe years, but now that it was here, it was not how she had pictured it. Her husband sat silently beside her, staring straight ahead. There was no conversation, no small talk. She had wanted warmth, a smile, some kind of gesture to welcome her to this new life. Instead, there was only silence. The town was quiet. A few people walked along the streets, returning from their work or going to the market. Children ran around laughing, and the occasional dog barked from a distance. It should have been a comforting scene, but she could not feel it. She felt trapped. Her stomach was tight with worry, and her hands felt clammy. She had known that this move would be difficult, but she had hoped for more than this cold, distant reception. She wanted a home filled with love, a place where she could feel safe. She had hoped for kindness, and instead, she felt alone. She tried to imagine her new house as a home, but every thought was shadowed by the emptiness she already sensed. The walls seemed too tall, the air too still, and the silence too loud. Her heart ached, and she wondered if she had made a mistake. As the carriage came to a stop, she stepped down cautiously. The wheels rattled on the gravel road, and she held her dress tightly around her legs. Her husband did not help her out, nor did he look at her. He simply opened the door and walked ahead toward the house. She hesitated for a moment, then followed. The house was small, but well kept. It looked sturdy, with wooden beams and a chimney that puffed a thin trail of smoke into the sky. She took a deep breath, hoping that the warmth inside would match the beauty outside. But the moment she stepped through the door, she felt the cold emptiness again. The rooms were quiet. There were no pictures on the walls, no flowers on the table. The furniture was practical but lacked charm. The house felt like it belonged to someone who did not want to welcome anyone. It was clean, yes, but sterile. She wondered if her hopes had been naive. Days passed slowly. She tried to make conversation, to smile, to offer small kindnesses. She cooked meals carefully, cleaned the rooms, and tried to learn the rhythm of this new life. She wanted to be a good wife, to fit in, to create something warm in this cold house. But every effort seemed to fall flat. Her husband remained distant, sometimes sharp, often indifferent. His words were few, and when he spoke, they felt cold and empty. She began to feel invisible, like a shadow moving through a space that was not meant for her. She thought of her family and the life she had left behind. She missed the laughter of her friends, the comfort of familiar streets, and even the ordinary routines she had once taken for granted. She had come here with hope, but hope seemed fragile now. It slipped through her fingers like sand. Each day was a struggle to remain composed, to keep her face calm and her heart from breaking. She wondered if anyone could understand what she felt. One morning, she decided to go into the town. She told her husband she needed to buy supplies, and though he barely responded, she left the house. The streets were empty as she walked, and the sun was warm on her back. She passed a small general store and stepped inside. The scent of wood and dried herbs filled the air. Behind the counter stood a man who looked older than most people in the town. He had a rugged face, lined with years of work in the sun. His eyes were kind, but observant. He greeted her with a nod, not too formal, not too distant. She felt a small flicker of relief. Maybe someone here could see her, could notice that she needed a friend. She asked about basic supplies and made small conversation. He answered kindly, and for the first time in days, she felt a warmth that had been missing. The man was a rancher. He owned land outside the town and had spent his life caring for animals, tending fields, and living close to the land. He spoke simply, but his words carried weight. There was a calm strength in him, a patience that seemed rare in the world. The bride found herself lingering, asking questions about the ranch, about life in the town. He told stories of long days in the sun, of struggles with weather and animals, of simple joys that made hard work worthwhile. She listened, captivated. His words were honest, unpretentious, and somehow comforting. She felt a sense of ease she had not known in weeks. Here for a moment, the weight in her chest lifted. She laughed quietly at one of his stories, and it felt like a small miracle. The sound of her own laughter startled her. It had been so long since she had laughed freely. Over the next few days, she found herself returning to the store. Sometimes she pretended to buy things she did not need. Sometimes she simply wanted to see the man who spoke with such steady kindness. He never forced conversation, never pressed her to share, but when she did, he listened. His presence was steady, a silent support. She began to look forward to these moments, to the chance to feel seen, even if briefly. In his words, she discovered small pieces of courage. He spoke of life with resilience, of facing hardship without surrender, of the quiet strength that comes from believing in oneself. She carried these words with her back to the house, whispering them to herself when the cold silence pressed in. They were like small candles in the dark rooms of her heart. Her husband noticed changes in her behavior. She smiled more often, walked with a lighter step, and seemed less timid in her movements. He did not understand it. Sometimes he scowled, sometimes he ignored it, but she no longer felt crushed by his disapproval. She had found a small corner of the world where she could breathe. The rancher's words had given her a sense of hope, a sense that perhaps life could be different. She did not yet know how, but she felt the first stirrings of courage. For the first time since arriving, she felt that she might survive, that she might find a way to reclaim her life. The days were still long, the house still cold, but something inside her had shifted. She had found a reason to keep going. Small but powerful hope that whispered she could endure, she could rise, she could live again. She spent hours thinking about the rancher's stories. She imagined the wide fields, the animals under the sun, the simple beauty of honest work. She pictured herself strong and independent, able to make choices without fear. Each thought was like a small stone added to the foundation of her courage. She realized that hope was not something she could wait for. It was something she had to carry, nurture, and act upon. She felt the first stirrings of determination. She would not allow herself to be crushed by fear. She would find her own strength. She would learn to live for herself, even in this place that seemed so unwelcoming. The rancher's words had planted a seed. Now it was beginning to grow. She began to notice details in the town she had missed before. The way the light fell on the rooftops in the morning, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery, the sound of children playing in the streets. These small things became a source of comfort. She realized that beauty and kindness existed even in places that felt harsh and unfeeling. She remembered the rancher's stories of resilience and strength. She remembered his calm voice, the gentle encouragement in his eyes. She began to understand that courage did not mean never being afraid. It meant moving forward even when afraid. It meant finding light in small moments, even when the world felt dark. Each visit to the store, each exchange with the rancher, strengthened her resolve. She began to imagine a future where she was no longer trapped by fear, where she could make her own choices, where she could find joy again. The thought was both frightening and exhilarating. She did not yet know how to get there, but she knew she had to try. The seed of hope had taken root, and she could feel it growing stronger with each passing day. The days passed slowly but surely. The bride found herself leaving the house more often, sometimes for errands, sometimes for a simple walk through the quiet streets. Each visit was a small rebellion against the heaviness that weighed on her inside. The town began to feel less empty as she noticed the rhythm of life around her. The sound of footsteps on the gravel, the creak of doors opening and closing, the laughter of children in the distance, it all felt like life was moving on, even if her own heart felt stuck. She carried herself with a little more confidence now, though still cautiously aware of the eyes that watched her every move. She began to visit the store regularly. The rancher was always there, quietly working, but he would pause to greet her. She felt a strange comfort in the routine. The world seemed easier to bear when she knew he would be there. He never asked too much about her life, never pressed her to speak. Yet when she did talk, he listened without judgment, offering gentle advice through stories of his own experiences. He spoke of hard times on the ranch, the unpredictability of nature, the patience needed to care for animals. Each story had a lesson, not forced, but natural, about resilience, persistence, and the quiet power of hope. She began to open up slowly. She told him about her marriage, carefully avoiding words that might draw too much attention. She spoke of the loneliness, the coldness, the small daily fears that kept her heart tight. His eyes met hers with understanding, and he did not interrupt. He listened, letting her words float in the space between them. When he spoke, it was with care, his voice steady and calm, like the hands of a clock that never hurried. He told her that life could be hard, that people sometimes disappoint, but that strength was found not in control over others, but in control over oneself. He explained that courage was quiet and patient, growing slowly like a seed beneath the soil until it was ready to bloom. The bride began to carry his words with her everywhere. She whispered them when the house felt cold, when her husband's sharp tones cut through her day, when she felt the walls of her life closing in. His advice was never a plan or a solution. It was a light, small but steady, that illuminated possibilities she had not seen before. She began to imagine a life where she could make her own choices, where fear did not dictate her every action. The idea terrified her at first. It was easier to remain small, quiet, invisible. Yet the seed of courage had been planted, and it grew with each day. Watered by the steady rhythm of her visits to the rancher, one morning she decided to walk further than usual. The road led her to the outskirts of the town where fields stretched wide and open. The air smelled of fresh earth and grass, and the sun warmed her back. She felt a strange lightness in her chest, a feeling she had not known in weeks. She stopped and looked around, breathing in the vast openness. It seemed impossible to be trapped here, surrounded by endless sky and open land. The thought made her smile, quietly at first, then more fully. She realized that the world was larger than the house she returned to each evening. There was space to breathe, space to think, space to grow. The rancher had spoken of this openness, of the freedom that came from connection to the earth and to one's own strength. Now she could feel it herself. As the weeks passed, the bride noticed small changes in herself. She moved with more confidence around the house. She spoke more clearly, her voice steadier. Her hands no longer trembled as often, and her eyes, once cast downward, now lifted to meet others. She still feared her husband's moods, still felt the sharp sting of loneliness at times, but she carried a shield of hope that grew stronger every day. The rancher's stories had shown her that strength was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. She began to recognize the moments when she could exercise that strength. Simple decisions, like going into town alone or asking a neighbor for advice, came acts of courage in themselves. One afternoon, she ran into an older woman in the market. The woman had noticed her quiet strength and asked if she was adjusting to life in the town. The bride hesitated but found herself telling a small truth. She spoke of her struggles and her fears, of the heavy silence at home, and of the little hope that kept her moving forward. The woman listened carefully, nodding, and then shared stories of her own youth, of hardship and survival, of small victories that became a lifetime of resilience. The bride left the market feeling lighter, her chest less tight. She realized that hope could be contagious, that sharing one's burdens could lessen their weight. The rancher had shown her this, but the interaction with the woman confirmed it. There was strength in connecting with others, in speaking and being heard, in allowing kindness to flow freely in both directions. At home, the tension with her husband remained. Some days were worse than others. He would scowl, dismiss her words, or remain coldly silent. Yet the bride no longer let it crush her. She remembered the rancher's quiet lessons. She recalled the openness of the fields, the patience of tending animals, the resilience required to survive even the harshest storms. She realized that the power to endure, to grow, and to move forward lay within her. She could not change her husband, nor could she control his moods, but she could choose her response. She could carry hope with her, even when the world felt harsh and unforgiving. She began small acts of self-care, taking walks, tending small gardens, speaking kindly to herself. Each act was a quiet rebellion, a reclaiming of her own life in tiny increments. The rancher continued to be a steady presence. One evening, as she lingered at the store, she confessed her fear of never being able to escape the heaviness that weighed her down. He spoke gently, telling her that life was rarely easy, but that courage was always possible. He explained that hope was not a sudden gift, but a practice, something nurtured day by day. He encouraged her to notice the small moments of beauty, to trust her instincts, and to act with integrity and patience. She left the store that evening with a new determination, feeling as though she carried a small lantern in the darkness, illuminating the path ahead. She began to plan quietly, not in rebellion or anger, but in preparation. She thought about her future, about the steps she might take to reclaim her autonomy, to protect her peace, to live more fully. She considered the neighbors she could trust, the community members who might offer support, and the skills she had learned that could help her stand independently. The rancher had never told her what to do, but his words had guided her toward clarity. She now felt capable of making her own choices. Even in the face of fear and uncertainty, every night she returned home with a quiet resolve. She moved through the rooms with more ease, cleaned with purpose, and tended to her surroundings with care. She began to notice details she had ignored before: the warmth of sunlight through the windows, the texture of fabric under her hands, the subtle sense of cooking and wood. These small details became anchors, reminders that life could be gentle and nurturing, even in a place that had felt cold. She realized that hope was not a grand event, but a series of small acts, moments of courage, and the ability to recognize beauty amidst difficulty. The town began to feel less intimidating. Faces she had once found cold or distant now seemed familiar, and some even kind. The bride found small joys in ordinary interactions, from a nod of recognition to a shared smile. Each day built upon the last, creating a fragile but growing network of hope and resilience. The rancher's words were never far from her mind. She thought of his steady presence, his patient listening, and the wisdom he shared through stories of life and work. She realized that even in silence, there could be guidance. Even in hardship, there could be strength. And even in loneliness, there could be connection. By the end of the second month, she could feel the difference within herself. She was no longer the same fragile, timid person who had arrived. She had discovered the first threads of courage and independence. She had learned to listen to herself, to trust her own judgment, and to nurture the small light of hope that now lived in her chest. She was beginning to understand that life could be more than fear and silence. She could feel possibility in every step she took, in every word she spoke, and in every quiet decision she made. The rancher's words had planted a seed, and it was blooming, slowly but surely, into a promise of something better, something she could call her own. The bride woke early that morning with a heaviness in her chest. The house was quiet, the sun just beginning to filter through the thin curtains. She lay for a moment, listening to the faint sounds of the town waking up, the distant crowing of a rooster, the soft shuffle of people beginning their day. Her heart felt tight. Something had shifted overnight, though she could not name it fully. She sensed that a change was coming, that the days of quiet endurance were reaching a point where she could no longer remain passive. The memories of the rancher's words returned to her, his calm voice reminding her that courage was built in small steps, one moment at a time. Today, she knew she could take a step toward reclaiming herself. Her husband was already awake, moving about with a kind of rigid precision that made the house feel even smaller. He said little, only ordering her to complete simple tasks, the tone flat and controlled. She obeyed, but her movements were deliberate, her mind focused elsewhere. She carried herself with more purpose, though inwardly she felt the familiar twinge of fear. The quiet moments of observation, the careful listening to his moods, had become a routine she had learned to manage. But now her thoughts were occupied by possibility, by the small flickers of independence she had nurtured since meeting the rancher. She knew that she could no longer live only to please him or hide herself in silence. Something had to change. She found herself thinking constantly of the rancher. His calm presence, his stories of resilience, and his gentle encouragement had given her a new way of seeing the world. She realized that he had never told her what to do, yet he had guided her to trust herself. She remembered the times she had sat in the store, listening to his voice as he spoke of long days in the fields, the patience required to care for animals, the quiet power of living with integrity. Those words had stayed with her, now forming a foundation of courage and hope that seemed almost tangible. They were more than words. They were a map of how to navigate fear, how to find strength when it seemed impossible, how to act when the heart trembled with uncertainty. Later that morning, she walked into town under the guise of errands. The streets were familiar now, and she moved with a confidence she had not known when she first arrived. The townspeople greeted her with nods and quiet smiles, and she returned them in kind, feeling a sense of belonging she had never experienced in the house she called home. She stopped briefly at the store, exchanging small words with the rancher. He noticed her tension but did not ask directly what troubled her. Instead, he shared a story about a young colt learning to walk, stumbling repeatedly but rising each time. The bride listened, feeling the metaphor echo in her life. She understood that stumbling did not mean failure, and rising was an act of courage, no matter how small or quiet. The story left her with a quiet determination. Today, she would rise. She returned home with a plan forming in her mind. It was not a plan of confrontation, but one of preparation. She needed to understand her options, to quietly assess the resources available to her, to build a foundation for her own autonomy. She moved through the house, noting the locks, the windows, the ways she could leave if necessary. She thought of trusted neighbors, the few people who had shown kindness, and how they might offer support. Her heart pounded, but she felt a strange clarity. Fear still existed, but it was now accompanied by purpose. She would not act recklessly, but she would act deliberately. Courage, she reminded herself, was not the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it. That evening, an incident occurred that shook her more than she expected. Her husband became irritable over a small domestic error, raising his voice in sharp, cutting words that made the air in the room feel thick and suffocating. The bride felt the familiar panic rising, the instinct to shrink and hide. But she paused, taking a slow breath, recalling the rancher's stories of patience and resilience. She reminded herself that she was capable of enduring and that she could act without violence, without surrendering her dignity. She spoke quietly, calmly, asserting a boundary she had never claimed before. She told him that she could not respond to anger with silence and that she needed space to think. The words trembled at first, but she held them, steadying herself with the image of wide fields, of sunlight, of the possibility of life beyond fear. Her husband's expression hardened, but she remained calm, refusing to shrink. She realized that speaking her truth, even quietly, was a first act of reclaiming herself. In the days that followed, she continued to build her quiet independence. She practiced small acts of courage, each one reinforcing her sense of self. She learned to walk to the market alone without fear, to interact with the townspeople confidently, to observe her surroundings carefully and understand the rhythms of her household. She found joy in small victories, in moments of laughter or recognition, in tiny glimpses of beauty she had once overlooked. She began to write in a journal, noting her thoughts, her fears, her small triumphs. Each word on the page strengthened her resolve. She discovered that documenting her life, her feelings, and her plans gave her a sense of control she had not known she could possess. The rancher's wisdom was always present in these moments, a quiet voice guiding her without direction, teaching her the value of patience, reflection, and deliberate action. She also began to notice the ways her husband's moods could be anticipated, the patterns of his irritability, the triggers that sparked anger. She learned to navigate these moments carefully, preserving her strength and dignity. She was not simply surviving. She was learning, observing, preparing. Each encounter became an opportunity to practice resilience, each day a chance to exercise her quiet courage. She realized that survival was not passive. It required thought, planning, and careful action. And in that realization, she found a sense of empowerment that no one could take away. Her interactions with the rancher deepened in subtle ways. Though he never asked too many personal questions, could sense the tension in her demeanor and offered stories and advice that spoke to her situation without naming it. He spoke of storms that battered barns, of young animals learning to navigate the world, of farmers overcoming setbacks through patience and persistence. Each story carried a lesson in endurance, in steady action, in the quiet power of perseverance. She absorbed these lessons, translating them into her own life. She began to understand that change did not need to be sudden or dramatic. It could be slow, methodical, deliberate, growing day by day until it was undeniable. This understanding strengthened her resolve to act when the time was right, to seize the moments when courage was needed most. One afternoon, she witnessed a neighbor helping another family with repairs on a fence. The scene struck her deeply. She realized that kindness and assistance existed even in a harsh world, that people could act with compassion without expectation of reward. She thought of the rancher and how his simple acts of listening and teaching had changed her perception of what was possible. These realizations filled her with determination. She began to see that she could build her own network of support, that she could quietly reach out to those she trusted, and that she could create a space for herself within the larger world. Even if her home remained constraining for now, at night, she lay awake thinking of the next steps. She imagined leaving, not recklessly or in anger, but deliberately, with a plan and a vision for her own life. She thought of the townspeople who might help, the skills she possessed, the courage she had cultivated over weeks of small victories. She imagined freedom not as a distant dream, but as a tangible possibility. Her heart beat faster at the thought, but the fear was now tempered by readiness. She understood that fear was part of the process, not a signal to retreat. Each day had taught her to navigate fear with intelligence and strength, and each night reaffirmed her resolve. She knew she was growing, evolving, becoming someone who could act decisively when the moment came. The bride also reflected on the emotional journey she had undergone. She recognized the quiet despair she had felt upon arrival, the loneliness that had seemed unbearable, the daily fear that had weighed on her like a heavy cloak. She saw how far she had come, how much she had learned about patience, resilience, and self-trust. The rancher's presence had been a constant, subtle guide, a mirror reflecting her own potential for strength. His words had been seeds planted in fertile ground, and now the first shoots of courage were rising, fragile but persistent, reaching toward light and possibility. She felt a deep gratitude for the lessons she had learned and a fierce determination to act upon them. By the end of the 3rd month, she felt the first stirrings of decisive action. She had cultivated patience, observation, and strength. She had built relationships of trust in the town and learned to navigate the challenges at home. She had discovered a capacity for courage she had never known, and she had begun to plan quietly, deliberately. For a moment, when she could step into her own life fully, when she could reclaim her freedom without sacrificing dignity or safety, the awareness filled her with anticipation, a mixture of fear and hope, a tension that propelled her forward. She understood that change would not be sudden. That courage was practiced in small, careful steps, and that the moment to act would come when preparation met opportunity. The days grew longer, and the bride began to notice the subtle changes in the town around her. The streets felt less intimidating, the neighbors' faces more familiar, and even the rhythm of her daily tasks began to feel less heavy. She moved through the routines of her life with a quiet determination, each action deliberate, each thought focused on building a future for herself. She had learned to navigate the tension at home, to protect her spirit from the harsh words and coldness that had once crushed her. The small light of hope she carried with her now grew brighter, fueled by her own courage and the steady guidance of the rancher's words that echoed in her mind. Every morning, she rose early, tending to small tasks around the house with careful attention. She cleaned the rooms with purpose, noticing details she had once overlooked: the warmth of sunlight on the wooden floors, the faint scent of herbs left from a previous meal, the quiet creak of the door as it opened and closed. These details became reminders that life existed beyond fear and control. They were small anchors in a world that had often seemed harsh and unwelcoming. She moved through her home not as a silent observer, but as someone who had begun to reclaim it piece by piece, moment by moment. Her visits to the town became more frequent, though always measured and deliberate. She spoke with neighbors, offering small kindnesses and receiving small gestures in return. She began to recognize patterns in the people she met: the farmer who always smiled when she passed, the woman who offered a nod of encouragement at the market, the children who waved as she walked by. These small connections strengthened her sense of belonging, reinforcing the quiet power of community and support. She realized that she did not need to face the world alone, and that even in a place that had seemed so distant and cold, there were allies and sources of strength. The rancher remained a steady presence in her life. Though he never intruded, he continued to offer stories and advice that spoke to her situation without naming it. He told of storms that battered barns and fences, of animals that struggled to survive, and of the patience and persistence required to care for them. Each story carried a lesson in endurance and the quiet power of resilience. She listened carefully, absorbing the lessons, translating them into her own life. She began to understand that change did not need to be sudden or dramatic. It could be slow, methodical, deliberate, growing day by day until it was undeniable. This understanding strengthened her resolve to act when the time was right, to seize the moments when courage was needed most. One afternoon, she noticed a commotion in the town square. A family was struggling to repair a broken cart, their frustration evident in sharp words and hurried movements. She stepped closer, offering to help, her hands steady despite the tension in the air. The family welcomed her assistance, and together they managed to fix the cart. The experience, though simple, filled her with a sense of accomplishment and connection. She realized that she could contribute, that she could be useful and valued beyond the walls of her home. The act reinforced her growing belief that she was capable of action, of making a difference, of claiming her place in the world. At home, the tension with her husband persisted, but she no longer allowed it to control her spirit. She practiced careful observation, noticing the patterns of his moods and the triggers that sparked anger. She learned to navigate these moments with patience, asserting her boundaries when necessary, protecting her peace without confrontation. Each successful encounter strengthened her confidence. Each small victory a reminder that she could endure and act with integrity. She realized that survival was not passive. It required thought, planning, and deliberate action. And in that realization, she found a sense of empowerment that no one could take away. The bride also began to explore her own interests and skills more fully. She took to gardening, tending a small plot near the house where she planted herbs and vegetables. She found joy in the growth of the plants and the rhythm of watering and tending, in the quiet satisfaction of seeing life flourish under her care. She began to cook meals with creativity and attention, experimenting with flavors and ingredients she had once only dreamed of using. Each act of creation reinforced her sense of agency, her belief in her own abilities, and her capacity to shape her life in meaningful ways. Her interactions with the rancher deepened in subtle ways. She began to ask questions about the land, the animals, and the challenges he faced on the ranch. He answered patiently, sharing knowledge without expectation or judgment. She absorbed the lessons eagerly, recognizing parallels between his life and her own. The patience required to care for animals, the resilience needed to withstand storms. The quiet determination to see things through all these lessons became tools she could apply to her own situation. She realized that strength was not always loud or visible. It could be quiet, steadfast, and persistent, growing slowly until it became undeniable. One evening, she walked along the outskirts of town, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The fields stretched wide and open, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. She felt a sense of freedom she had not known in months. The open space reminded her that the world was larger than the confines of her home, larger than the fear that had once held her captive. She thought of the rancher's words, of the stories of resilience and courage. She felt a deep sense of connection to the life beyond her immediate circumstances. She understood that she was capable of choosing her path, capable of acting with intention, capable of building a future for herself that is not defined by fear. The days continued in this rhythm of quiet growth and preparation. She nurtured her small garden, honed her skills, strengthened her connections with the town, and continued to absorb the lessons of patience and resilience from the rancher. She practiced self-care in small ways, taking walks, observing the world around her, and reflecting on her own progress. Each day reinforced her belief that she could act with courage, that she could reclaim her autonomy, that she could build a life defined by choice and hope rather than fear and control. The bride also began to consider the practical steps needed to secure her independence. She thought about the skills she had, the resources available in the town, and the allies she could trust. She began to make quiet plans, considering the timing and method of her actions carefully. She understood that patience was essential, that hasty decisions could jeopardize her safety and progress. Each step was deliberate, each thought measured, each action part of a larger strategy to reclaim her life on her own terms. Throughout this time, she continued to draw strength from the stories and guidance of the rancher. His calm presence and steady wisdom had become a foundation upon which she could build. She realized that courage was not a sudden gift, but a practice, something nurtured day by day through observation, reflection, and deliberate action. She carried these lessons with her into every interaction, every decision, every moment of her life. They became tools she could use to navigate the challenges at home, to assert her boundaries, to protect her spirit, and to prepare for the moment when she could step fully into her own power. By the end of the 4th month, the bride had transformed in ways she could not have imagined when she first arrived. She was stronger, more confident, more deliberate in her actions and choices. She had built a network of support within the town, cultivated practical skills, and nurtured a sense of hope that had grown steadily over time. She had learned to navigate fear with patience and intelligence, to observe and respond with care, to act with courage even in small moments. The seed of hope that had been planted by the rancher's words had blossomed into a strong, resilient determination that now guided her every step. The bride knew that the most challenging moments still lay ahead. She would need to act decisively, to assert her independence fully, to take the steps necessary to reclaim her life completely. But she no longer felt overwhelmed by fear. She had learned the power of preparation, the strength of patience, and the quiet force of courage. She understood that the journey ahead would require both strategy and heart, both careful planning and unwavering resolve. And she knew that she was ready, equipped with the lessons she had learned, the strength she had cultivated, and the hope that now burned brightly within her. The bride woke with the sunlight streaming through the window. The air felt warmer, lighter than it had in months. She rose slowly, stretching her arms and feeling the weight of uncertainty lessen in her chest. She had spent months quietly preparing, learning, growing, and strengthening herself. She had cultivated courage, patience, and determination, and now the time had come to act decisively. Her heart thumped with anticipation, a mixture of fear and excitement, yet it was tempered with clarity. She knew she was ready to reclaim her life. She had spent long nights imagining this moment, carefully planning every step, and now she felt the strength to take it. She could no longer wait. She could no longer live in the shadows of fear and isolation. The house was quiet as she moved through it. Her husband slept fitfully, unaware of the determination building in her mind. She packed a small bundle of essentials, each item carefully chosen. She included money she had saved from small errands, clothing, a few personal belongings, and a journal filled with her thoughts, reflections, and plans. Each item was a step toward independence, a tangible preparation for the life she intended to claim. She paused for a moment to breathe, feeling the sunlight on her face and the warmth of possibility in her chest. She whispered quietly to herself, reminding herself of the lessons she had learned. Courage was not the absence of fear. Hope was a practice, and strength was cultivated day by day. Once she felt steady, she quietly opened the door and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, filled with the scent of earth and grass. She moved quickly but carefully down the path that led from the house to the town, aware of her surroundings, aware of her own strength. Each step was deliberate, carrying her closer to freedom. She remembered the stories the rancher had shared, the patience of animals learning to navigate the world, the resilience required to overcome storms, the quiet determination needed to face challenges. She drew strength from these lessons, carrying them with her as if they were armor against doubt and fear. She reached the edge of the town and paused for a moment. Glancing back at the house that had been both her prison and her classroom, she felt a mixture of sorrow and resolve. Sorrow for the life she had hoped to have and the years she had spent in fear, and resolve for the life she intended to build from this point forward. She stepped forward with confidence, moving into the town and seeking out the allies she had quietly identified over the past months. Neighbors who had shown kindness, townspeople she had come to trust, and the small network of support she had nurtured all became part of her plan. Each interaction reinforced her courage, each small gesture a confirmation that she was not alone. The rancher's store was her first stop. She entered and saw him quietly tending to his tasks. He looked up, and in his eyes she saw understanding, recognition, and gentle encouragement. She did not need to explain everything. He had been a quiet guide, a steady presence, a source of wisdom and hope. She smiled, feeling the weight of months of preparation lift slightly from her shoulders. She shared a brief word of thanks, knowing that his stories and guidance had carried her to this moment. His nod was quiet but full of meaning, a reminder that courage grows quietly. Nurtured by patience and reflection, with the support of trusted townspeople, she began to put her plan into action. They helped ensure her path would be safe, guiding her quietly, offering advice and assistance without judgment or intrusion. She felt a surge of gratitude and relief, realizing that her courage had been matched by the kindness of others. She was not only acting for herself, but stepping into a community that valued her strength, her autonomy, and her dignity. Each careful step she took was reinforced by the steady presence of support and the knowledge that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. As she moved through the town, she reflected on the lessons she had learned over the past months. She thought of the quiet resilience she had cultivated, the patience she had practiced, the courage she had nurtured in small but meaningful acts. She realized that each day, each interaction, each challenge had prepared her for this moment. She was not acting recklessly or impulsively. She was acting deliberately, with clarity and confidence. She understood that the path ahead would require continued strength, but she was ready to meet it. She felt empowered, grounded, and fully present in her determination to reclaim her life. By midday, she had completed the first steps of her departure. She had gathered necessary supplies, secured the support she needed, and set her course toward a life where she could make her own choices. Her heart was steady, her mind clear, and her spirit strong. She paused briefly to reflect on the journey she had traveled, the fear that had once threatened to overwhelm her, the loneliness that had seemed insurmountable, the small victories that had grown into a foundation of courage. She realized that her journey had been one of transformation, not only of circumstance but of self. She had discovered the power within herself to endure, to act, and to hope. As the sun began its descent in the late afternoon, she reached a quiet place outside the town. She looked back once, feeling a mixture of closure and relief. The house that had once held her captive was now behind her, a chapter of learning, resilience, and preparation. She turned forward, feeling the possibilities of the future spread out before her like the wide-open fields she had once admired from a distance. The lessons of courage, patience, and determination carried her onward, a steady presence guiding her steps. She understood that her life was now hers to shape, that fear no longer dictated her choices, and that hope had become a constant companion rather than a fragile dream. The rancher's words echoed in her mind as she walked. Strength grows quietly. Courage is built in small steps. Hope is nurtured day by day. She realized that these words had been true in ways she had only just begun to understand. Her life was no longer defined by fear or control, but by the deliberate choices she made, the actions she took, and the courage she cultivated. Each step forward was an act of empowerment, each breath a reminder of the resilience she had discovered. She felt a deep sense of gratitude for the guidance she had received and the strength she had developed on her own. As night approached, she arrived at a place where she could rest safely. She set down her belongings, feeling a sense of relief and accomplishment. She reflected on the journey she had traveled, the despair she had felt upon arrival, the small moments of courage she had practiced, the wisdom she had absorbed, and the deliberate actions that had brought her to this point. She understood that life would continue to hold challenges, but she was ready to meet them with confidence, patience, and resilience. She had reclaimed her power, her autonomy, and her hope. In the days that followed, she began to build her new life. She found work in the town that allowed her to support herself, formed friendships with people who respected her and valued her strength, and continued to practice the lessons she had learned from the rancher. She nurtured her spirit with small acts of self-care, observed the world with a renewed sense of curiosity, and moved forward with deliberate intention. Each day reinforced her belief that she could create a life defined by her own choices, guided by hope and courage, and filled with the possibility of growth and happiness. The bride never forgot the rancher's role in her journey. His quiet guidance, steady presence, and stories of resilience had given her the foundation to reclaim her life. She carried his words with her, not as instructions, but as a source of strength and inspiration. She understood that true courage was built over time, nurtured through reflection, and reinforced by deliberate action. She had learned that hope could grow even in the darkest circumstances, that strength could be cultivated quietly, and that life could be shaped by intention and determination. As she settled into her new life, she felt a sense of peace and fulfillment she had never known before. She had faced fear, endured hardship, and acted with courage to reclaim her independence. She had discovered the power within herself to shape her life, to choose her path, and to embrace hope as a constant companion. The journey had not been easy, but it had transformed her in ways she had never imagined. She had grown stronger, wiser, and more resilient. She had found a sense of freedom and possibility that would guide her for the rest of her life. Her heart was no longer weighed down by fear. Her spirit was no longer constrained by control or isolation. She moved through each day with confidence, guided by the lessons she had learned and the courage she had cultivated. She had reclaimed her life, her hope, and her future. And as she looked out over the wide-open fields and the quiet town she now called home, she felt a deep sense of gratitude and triumph. She had survived, she had grown, and she had found the life she had always imagined, one built on courage, resilience, and hope.